They say the hardest part of deployment is the silence. The long, empty hours in a desert thousands of miles away from home, where the mind plays tricks on you and all you crave is the familiar scent of your own living room, the creak of your front door, and the safety of the four walls you bled and sweat to pay for. For 9 months, that image was my anchor. I am Maya, a captain in the United States Army, and that modest, beautiful craftsman-style house in Georgia wasn't just real estate to me. It was my sanctuary. It was the physical proof that a girl who grew up in the foster care system had finally built a permanent foundation. I trusted it to the one person I thought loved me unconditionally, my fiancé David, but what I didn't know that day, as I boarded the transport plane back to the States, was that the silence I feared wasn't in the desert. It was waiting for me at home. A suffocating, treacherous silence that would expose a betrayal so deep it made the battlefield feel safe. When my boots hit the tarmac, there was no David waiting with a sign. My texts went unanswered. My calls drifted straight to voicemail. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, settled deep into my chest. I took a rideshare straight to my address, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thought he was hurt. I thought there had been an accident. But as the car pulled up to my driveway, my breath caught in my throat. The beautiful, deep navy paint I had chosen for the exterior was gone, replaced by a garish, bright white. A strange, luxury SUV was parked where my truck used to be, and hanging from the porch, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, was a sign that shattered my world into 1,000 unfixable pieces. It didn't say welcome home, it didn't have my name. It was a customized plaque that read the Altons. Est. 2026. I stepped out of the vehicle, my uniform suddenly feeling heavy, suffocating. I walked up the steps, every fiber of my being trembling. Through the large front window, I didn't see my cozy furniture or my framed military commendations. I saw modern, expensive decor, and sitting on a brand-new plush sofa was David. He wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm, laughing brightly while sipping wine from my crystal glasses, was a woman I recognized instantly. It was Sarah, my absolute best friend since college, the woman who had wept tears of joy when David proposed to me. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open, the old familiar creak completely gone, replaced by a sterile, silent glide. The laughter in the room died instantly. David's face drained of color, his wine glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the hardwood floor. Sarah let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody spoke. The air was thick with the stench of guilt and absolute ruin. Until everything changed and the man I loved looked at me not with remorse, but with a cold, calculated defiance. "Maya," David stammered, scrambling to his feet, trying to step between me and Sarah. You weren't supposed to be back until next week." "Whose house is this, David?" My voice didn't sound like mine. It was hollow, detached, echoing from a place of deep, sudden trauma. I looked around the room. My grandmother's antique clock was gone. My books were gone. Everything that made this place mine had been systematically erased. Sarah stood up, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding my gaze completely. She looked expensive, draped in silk that I knew, with a sudden sickening clarity had been bought with my money. "Maya, please, let's just calm down and talk," she whispered, her voice trembling but devoid of any real apology. "Talk?" I stepped closer, the discipline of my training keeping my posture rigid, though inside I was falling apart, bleeding from a wound no medic could bandage. "I have been in a combat zone for 9 months. I gave you power of attorney, David, to manage my mortgage, to take care of my property, and I come home to find my best friend living in my house, with your name on the door?" Then came the moment that turned my profound heartbreak into a blazing, unyielding fire. David squared his shoulders. The guilt vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cruel, arrogant smirk. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, tossing it onto the marble kitchen island. "It's not your house anymore, Maya," he said, his voice dropping into a chilling, casual tone. "Look at the deed. It's registered to Alton Holdings, LLC, which is owned by me and Sarah. You signed the transfer before you deployed, don't you remember?" My heart stopped. I stared at the paper. My signature was right there at the bottom of a quitclaim deed. It was dated just 3 days before I shipped out. My mind raced back to that chaotic week. I remembered the stack of documents David had brought me, claiming they were standard military housing stipends and power of attorney updates. I had trusted him blindly. I had signed where he told me to sign because I loved him, because I believed he was my protector while I was away protecting our country. "You tricked me," I whispered, the betrayal burning through my veins like poison. "You stole from me." "Good luck proving that in court," David sneered, crossing his arms. "You were deployed. You weren't here. The paperwork is legally binding, filed, and notarized. We didn't break any laws, Maya. We just updated the management. You chose your career over a family." Sarah was here. She helped me realize what a real home feels like. "We've already packed your stuff. It's in a storage unit down the road. I'll text you the gate code. Now, I suggest you leave before we call the police for trespassing." Trespassing, in my own home, the house I bought with my enlistment bonus, the house where I had mapped out my entire future. Sarah wouldn't even look at me. She just stared at the floor, gently rubbing her stomach. And that was when I noticed the slight swell beneath her dress. She was pregnant. They hadn't just stolen my property. They had stolen the life I was supposed to build, using my own financial sacrifice to fund their new, blissful beginning. I looked at them both, my vision blurring with tears that I refused to let fall in front of them. My chest felt tight, my soul completely shattered. I had faced enemy fire, I had faced the harshest conditions, but nothing could have prepared me for the agonizing pain of being destroyed by the people who held my heart. "You have 10 minutes to get your uniform out of our house," David added, his voice dripping with condescension. I didn't say another word. I turned around, picked up my duffel bag, and walked out into the fading daylight. That night, I stayed in a sterile, lonely motel room down the highway. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the room crushing me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. I saw Sarah laughing in my kitchen. I saw David's arrogant smirk. The pain was in physical weight, an agonizing ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I felt broken. I felt so incredibly foolish for trusting them, so exposed and vulnerable. I cried until I had no tears left, grieving the loss of my love, my friend, and my sanctuary. But as the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood, orange, and gold, something inside me shifted. The crying stopped. The trembling stopped. The military officer inside me, the strategist who had survived environments far more hostile than a suburban neighborhood, woke up. David thought he was clever. He thought because he had manipulated a stack of paperwork he was safe. He thought that because I was a woman who had just returned from war, I would be too emotionally exhausted to fight back. He forgot who I was. He forgot that I don't retreat. I regroup. They wanted to play a game of legal chess? Fine. But they didn't realize they were playing against someone who had spent her entire adult life learning how to dismantle threats with absolute, surgical precision. I opened my laptop. I didn't call a divorce attorney or a standard real estate lawyer. Instead, I called a contact I had made during my service, a high-ranking JAG officer who now ran a private, elite federal compliance firm. "Sir," I said when he answered, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of the pain from the night before. "I need an audit. A complete, unmerciful financial and legal audit on a man named David Alton and a company called Alton Holdings, ILC. The battle had begun, but this time I wasn't fighting for a country. I was fighting for my dignity, and I would not stop until their fraudulent castle was reduced to ash. Over the next 3 weeks, I discovered that David and Sarah's greed wasn't just limited to my house. When you are a thief, it is rarely your first time. My legal team dug deep into David's finances and the newly formed LLC. Because I had given him power of attorney, he had access to my primary bank accounts. He had used my deployment pay to fund the down payments on 2 other rental properties under Alton Holdings LLC. He had used my immaculate credit score to secure massive business loans, forging my signature on the cosigner documents while I was overseas. But his biggest mistake, the fatal error that would ensure his total undoing, was the Service Members Civil Relief Act. The SCRA is a strict federal law in the United States designed to protect active-duty military personnel from financial fraud, foreclosures, and major legal transactions while they are deployed. Under this law, any major change to a service member's property, credit, or legal status without explicit, verified, and heavily scrutinized military court approval is a severe federal offense. By transferring my deed using a fraudulent power of attorney while I was actively deployed in a combat zone, David hadn't just committed a civil wrong. He had violated a federal statute designed to protect the armed forces. And because he used my military pay and the internet to transfer the funds and file the forged documents, he had committed wire fraud and identity theft against an active military officer. I spent days sitting in a glass-walled office in downtown Atlanta, reviewing the evidence, every forged signature, every illegal bank transfer, every email between David and Sarah plotting how they would live in my house while I was gone, was laid out on the table. They had traded their ethics for luxury, completely blind to the trap they were building around themselves. "We can file a civil suit to get the house back immediately, Maya," my attorney told me, looking over his spectacles. "But with the federal violations we've uncovered, we can do much more. We can hand this directly to the federal prosecutor. It will take a little longer, but it will be absolute." I looked at the photos of my house, the house they had painted white to erase my memory. I thought about the pregnancy, the smug smiles, the way they threw me out like garbage. "Hand it to the feds," I said softly. "I want them to feel completely safe. I want them to think they won. And then, I want the ceiling to collapse on them when they least expect it." For 2 months, I stayed out of sight. I rented a quiet apartment near the base, focusing on my duties, letting David and Sarah believe their perfect little lie. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard they were planning an extravagant baby shower at their new house. They were expanding their business, feeling invincible. Until the morning of the baby shower. It was a beautiful Saturday. The driveway of my house was filled with the cars of their family and friends. Elegant decorations covered the front porch. Inside, guests were celebrating the impending arrival of their child. David and Sarah were at the center of it all, basking in the admiration of their peers. Then, 3 dark sedans pulled up to the curb. 6 federal agents, accompanied by local law enforcement and a military liaison, stepped out of the vehicles. They didn't knock gently. They walked right onto the property, presenting a federal arrest warrant and an asset seizure order. The front door opened, and the music inside died instantly for the second time, but this time it would never play again. I stood by the edge of the driveway, dressed in my full-dress uniform, watching from a distance as the drama unfolded. David was led out of the house in handcuffs, his face a mask of absolute terror and confusion. He was being charged with federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Because Alton Holdings LLC was funded entirely by stolen military pay and fraudulent loans, the federal government had frozen every single account associated with it. The rental properties, the luxury SUV, and my house were immediately seized under asset forfeiture laws. Sarah followed behind him, weeping hysterically, clutching her stomach, screaming at the officers as they read David his rights. She wasn't arrested that day due to her pregnancy, but she was handed a federal indictment as a co-conspirator. As David was being pushed into the back of the police cruiser, his eyes caught mine. He looked at me, standing tall, unbreakable, and decorated in the uniform he had tried to exploit. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the crushing realization that he had lost everything. He had tried to steal a home, and in return, he had traded his freedom. "Maya, please." He screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Help me. Tell them it was a mistake." I didn't answer. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a surge of petty joy. I just watched him get driven away, the sirens fading into the distance, leaving behind a crowd of stunned, silent guests who quickly began packing up their cars and fleeing the scene of a federal bust. Within 30 days, a federal judge voided the fraudulent quitclaim deed. The keys to my house were returned to me by a military representative. Walking back through that front door alone, the house felt empty. The modern furniture David and Sarah bought had been cleared out by the bank. The walls were bare. But as I stood in the center of my living room, feeling the warm Georgia sunlight stream through the windows, the suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for months finally evaporated. They had tried to dismantle my life while I was away serving my country. They thought that by taking my physical walls they could break my spirit, but they failed to realize that a house is just wood, brick, and paint. A true home is built on honor, integrity, and resilience, things that neither of them could ever possess or steal. David was eventually sentenced to 4 years in a federal penitentiary, and Sarah's credit and reputation were permanently ruined, forcing her to move back in with her parents, entirely broke. I kept the house, but I didn't paint it back to the original navy blue. I left it white. A stark, bright reminder that no matter how dark the betrayal, no matter how shattered you feel, you can always clean the slate. Justice isn't about anger, it's about restoring balance. And as I sit on my porch today, watching the sunset, I am finally at peace. I survived the war abroad, and I won the war at home.